when the lecture's over, and I'll just turn it over to Jim.
All right, thanks, Stuart. Tonight's lecture is on the Philidor counter gambit. Many people don't even know what the Philidor counter gambit is. It's basically the Philidor defense with the move F5. And this opening was invented by Philidor in 1749. Philidor was a Frenchman. He lived from 1726 until 1795. And Schenck, in his book, The Immortal Game, points out that Philidor's philosophy of the pawns being the soul of chess was nothing more than a product of the times, because that was the period leading up to the French Revolution, when political thinkers were developing this new idea that the common man were more important than the king and the queen and the aristocrats. So Philidor's philosophy of how to play a chess game is tied into the political thinking of that era. That's why he said that the pawns are the soul of chess. Now you'll see that the first three moves for black are all pawn moves. In fact, there's some variations in the Philidor counter game. We might make 6 or 7 straight pawn moves, and that may explain why the opening isn't that popular, because nowadays most chess players think that you should be developing your pieces. Philidor felt that this is a non-developing move. The move knight f3 to Philidor would be just as bad a move as if black had played bishop to d6. Bishop to d6 to guard the pawn would be bad because you're blocking in your d pawn. And Philidor felt that the move knight f3 blocks in the f pawn. So as far as Philidor was concerned, this move was a positional blunder, and the correct way to punish it was with a flank attack to knock out this pawn. That would have been the Greco counter gambit. We now call it the Latvian gambit. Basically, the Philidor counter gambit is nothing more than the Greco counter gambit deferred. Philidor's idea is first play d6, very similar to what Bobby Fischer called in his Bust of the King's Gambit. He called d6 a high-class waiting move in his Bust of the King's Gambit to prevent the Kieseritzky gambit where the knight goes to e5. Well, in a similar manner, Philidor said, first play d6, wait until white plays d4, and now play f5. And another reason why you should wait a tempo is because when I, as white, am facing the Latvian gambit, as it's now known, I'll just simply go pawn to d3, and when they go d6, I'll now transpose it to the game Magnus Carlsen versus Sergei Dolmatov, which Carlsen is white won in like 21 moves. Basically, Carlsen just developed and castled, brought his king to safety, and then in a timely moment he goes d4. And then he brings his bishop out, and he had an overwhelming position. But because in the Philidor counter game, but white's already played the move pawn to d4, that's no longer a viable option. So so the move pawn to d6 not only prevents the knight from arriving in e5, it also makes sure that this pawn will be knocked out by the f pawn. You can't play pawn to d3 to guard it. You can't play pawn to f3 because the knight's on that square. Basically, it's the move knight to f3 which enables you to play the Philidor counter gambit. I once had a 2300 say to me, Jim, I don't think the Philidor counter gambit's playable because basically it's the king's gambit for black, a tempo down, and the king's gambit for white is kind of dubious to begin with. And I said, well, actually, you're wrong. It's really a tempo up because, unlike the king's gambit, when your pawn arrives on e4, it's arriving with tempo. If this knight wasn't on f3, the Philidor counter gambit would not be playable because now you're just weakening your position. But you're going to gain a tempo by kicking this knight on f3. Philidor's book, The Analysis of the Game of Chess, that's the English translation of the title, was published in 1749. Raymond Keane, in his book, The Evolution of Chess Theory from Philidor to Kasparov, says that the Philidor counter gambit is the first theoretical chess opening. This is really where chess theory begins, in 1749. And according to legend, George Washington had a copy of Philidor's book, and Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin. So Philidor would have been the world champion had there been an official world championship in the 1700s. Philidor is generally recognized as being the strongest chess player of his time. Now his family name was actually Daniken. His family was originally from Scotland, just as Morphy's family was originally from Ireland and were Murphy, but when they moved to France, Murphy became Morphy. The Duncan family, D-U-N-C-A-N, became known as the Daniken family when they moved to France. And it's kind of humorous the way they got the name Philidor. All of Philidor's grandfather and uncle and father were all musicians. Philidor himself composed operas. He died in London in 1795. His opera company was staging an opera when the French Revolution broke out, and they decided to remain in London, that it would be too dangerous to go back to France in light of what was happening. And his grandfather, Grandfather Daniken, I'll call him, once played the oboe for Louis XIII, the Emperor of France. And Louis XIII was so impressed that he nicknamed Grandpa Daniken, I'll call him, Philidor. Philidor was the world-renowned oboist of that time. I think he was an Italian. And somehow that name stuck. So the family that had been known as Daniken now became known as Philidor. They changed the spelling of it, PH instead of with an F. So actually, I guess we're kind of lucky. This opening might be known as the Daniken counter gambit if it weren't for Louis XIII, which doesn't sound as good somehow as the Philidor counter gambit. And really, it's the Philidor defense. Those other lines that we call the Philidor defense, Philidor never played them, and the reason why he never played them, he never intended those variations. What happened is, in later years, people say, well, how about if instead of playing F5, we play this move, the Hanon variation, or we play this move, the Nimzovich variation, or we play pawn captures pawn, or bishop to G4. They said, well, what do we call these other lines? And somebody said, well, we'll call them the Philidor defense. Okay, well now what do we call this thing, which used to be the Philidor defense? It's what's known as a retronym. A retronym is when you go back and rename something like in a backwards manner. And they said, well, we'll call that the Philidor counter gambit. But this pawn on D6, Philidor would never have approved of a pawn blocking the bishop. This pawn, in fighting chess, Garry Kasparov describes a similar pawn maneuver from a different opening where black moves the pawn to D6, and then a few moves later he goes pawn to D5, and he writes that the D pawn hurries to D5 by moving slowly. And a friend of mine who majored in history said, well, all that is a paraphrase of the Roman army under Julius Caesar. They had a saying that the Roman army hurries by marching slowly. That was supposedly their favorite saying. So this is a high-class waiting move because eventually this pawn's going to wind up on D5. After this pawn gets knocked out, this pawn will move to D5, and now this bishop will be able to develop. That's why those variations, which we call the Philidor defense, Philidor never played them. Now, the pedigree of this opening is really very good. It was invented by the unofficial world champion of the 1700s, but the player who championed it, Paul Morphy, a century later, is generally recognized as the unofficial world champion of the 1800s. Bobby Fischer went one step further and thought that Paul Morphy was the best chess player in history. And yet, for some reason, I've never been able to figure out this opening, which you would think, based on his pedigree, two giants in chess history, one invented it, the other one championed it. Morphy never lost a game with it. He had 3 wins and 2 draws. And he played against the likes of Howard Staunton and Jacob Lowenthal and Samuel Bowden and Henry Bird and Thomas Barnes. He played this against the best players of his time. Yet for some reason the opening has a very bad reputation, probably because Wilhelm Steinitz and Morphy had a rivalry. Morphy was clearly the better player. He won all the battles, but Steinitz won the war. The philosophical war of the correct way to play a game of chess, as we all know, is Steinitz's philosophy prevailed historically. Everybody, myself included, I didn't get to be a chess master except by learning Steinitz's general principles. I read Kotov's book, Think Like a Grandmaster, where he gives you the 5 general principles and gives you illustrative games on how each general principle is put into practice. So all of us think of Steinitz as the father of modern chess, which he is, but unfortunately, he had a problem with Paul Morphy. You know, he was kind of like Salieri to Mozart. If you ever seen the movie Amadeus, where Salieri, you know, he kind of had a love-hate relationship with Mozart. He's kind of glad that Mozart died on the one hand, and yet on the other hand, he feels guilty because he knew Mozart was this great composer. But if not for Mozart, he would have been recognized as the greatest composer of his era. Steinitz kind of played second fiddle to Morphy all of his life until Morphy died. In fact, he had to wait until after Morphy's death before he proclaimed himself world champion at Shaolin Soccer Tour to a match. He always lived in the shadow of Paul Morphy. And Alekhine, there's a book, I already mentioned the book, The Evolution of Chess Theory by Raymond Keane. Now, the British, for some reason, don't like Paul Morphy. I suspect it has to do with the Howard Staunton incident. They always they always favor Howard Staunton's side in that controversy. You know, we think that Morphy went to England and Staunton dodged him and he evaded him and he misled Morphy, but they think that Morphy was an opportunist and, you know, a fraud and everything else. So, in that book, The Evolution of Chess Theory, Paul Morphy's name is not mentioned at all. So Macon Chabot, the two-time Virginia State chess champion, wrote a book called Paul Morphy and the Evolution of Chess Theory. As if to say, you know, what about Paul Morphy? How can you write a book called The Evolution of Chess Theory and you leave out Paul Morphy? And, you know, Paul Morphy, I think, is the reason why the Philidor Gambit is held in such low regard, because the way Chabot describes it, he compares Steinitz's 11-page essay on Morphy. A year after Morphy's death, Steinitz writes an 11-page tribute to Paul Morphy. Well, Chabot calls it, he compares it to Mark Antony's funeral oration for Julius Caesar. Remember, Mark Antony says, you know, I'm not going to praise Caesar, I'm going to bury him. That's basically what Steinitz does. He pretends that he's praising Morphy, and all the while, you know, he's jabbing away at his reputation. So Steinitz really is the villain, so to speak, as to why the Philidor Gambit has a poor reputation. Steinitz was not attacking Philidor. Steinitz had nothing against Philidor philosophically, but his arch rival, Paul Morphy, championed this opening. Steinitz, in the words of Alekhine, who wrote an essay on Steinitz, said that Steinitz contributed a great deal to chess theory, but it's impossible, that's Alekhine's word, to agree with his views on Morphy, because Steinitz was trying to knock Morphy down from his pedestal. Those are Alekhine's words. So basically, the reason why the Philidor Gambit is called absolutely unsound and busted and junk, these are actual criticisms that have been made about it. It really dates back to 1885 when Steinitz, in that 11-page essay, mentions only one opening by name, and it's the Philidor Gambit. For some reason, he decided that that was going to be the vehicle by which he knocked Morphy down from his pedestal. And he even implies at the end of the essay that the reason why Morphy wound up walking the streets of New Orleans, muttering to himself in French, was that he used so much mental energy in playing the Philidor Gambit that it led to his mental breakdown. That was basically what Steinitz is implying, that if you read that essay, it's implicit in what he's saying. So Steinitz pronounced this opening absolutely unsound, but ironically, if you look at Steinitz's analysis of the Philidor Gambit, he gives equalizing variations. Now, I worked at a law firm for 28 years. I wasn't a lawyer, but you know, we used language very precisely. And if you say that something is absolutely unsound, how can you publish analysis where there's equalizing variations? I mean, there's something's not right there. And then when you look closely, you realize that all of the absolutely unsound variations were the lines that Morphy played in the Philidor Gambit, and all of the equalizing variations were the lines that Morphy didn't play. So right away, you know, you begin to understand what Alekhine was referring to when he said that Steinitz was trying to knock Morphy down from his pedestal. That it's impossible to agree with his opinions on Morphy. Now, 110 years later, in 1995, just to show you that this wasn't an isolated case, a book co-authored by an international master and a national master called The Big Book of Busts was published.